Hello and welcome to Meet the Professors. My name is Professor Deana Pollard Sacks and I'm your host today. Today we're going to be talking about the effects of violent video games on children's and adolescents' brains. My guests today are Craig Anderson, who is a professor of psychology, distinguished professor in liberal arts and sciences, and the director of the Center for the Study of Violence at Iowa State University. He is also a past president of the International Society for Research on Aggression. Brad Bushman will also be joining us remotely. He is a professor of communication and psychology and the Margaret Hall and Robert Randall Reinhardt Chair of Mass Communication at The Ohio State University.
Thanks for having me on your show, Deana. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining me, Craig.
Glad to be here, Deana.
So, first question is, how much time are children spending playing violent video games?
The numbers go up all the time. At the moment, meaning as of several years ago, kids on average were spending about 7 hours a day on media in general, TV, movies, video games, and music.
I have a question for Brad Bushman now. Brad, what is the big concern about violent video games?
We did a comprehensive review of every study conducted on violent video game effects. And our review included 381 effects from studies involving over 130,000 participants. So this isn't something we have to guess about or use hunches or intuitions or gut feelings. There's a large body of scientific evidence on this topic. The results from this comprehensive review clearly show that violent video games increase aggressive thoughts, they increase angry feelings, they increase physiological arousal such as blood pressure and heart rate, and we know that stress is bad for your heart. They increase aggressive behavior. They also decrease feelings of empathy and compassion for others, and they decrease helpful behaviors. These effects occur for both males and females of all ages, regardless of where they live in the world. So these are pretty robust and important effects for video games. Over 90% of kids today play video games, and as time goes on, video games are gradually displacing more passive forms of entertainment, such as watching TV or watching movies.
What is the most compelling research to date that violent video games in fact cause harm to children?
I think the evidence that we gathered from our comprehensive review involving 381 effects from studies that included over 130,000 participants is pretty compelling, especially the experimental studies, because they allow researchers to make cause-effect inferences. So in an experiment, you don't ask people, do you want to play a violent video game or do you want to play a non-violent video game? Because if you ask them that question, different types of people might choose to play the violent game versus the non-violent game. And then if those people were more aggressive afterwards, you wouldn't know if it's because of the type of person they are or the type of video game they played. So in an experimental study, we don't give people a choice. We flip a coin, and if it's heads, they play a violent game. If it's tails, they play a non-violent game. Therefore, you cannot say all the aggressive people played the violent game, because there's a 50-50 chance that they played the non-violent game. And so they should be equally aggressive before they play the game. If after they play the game, the violent game players are more aggressive than the non-violent game players, then what could have caused the difference? Actually, there are only two things. One is the game they played. That's the most persuasive explanation. The other is just a random fluke. But researchers are very careful to conduct rigorous statistical tests to minimize the chance of random flukes.
Now my question is, what would you say, Craig, is the most compelling research to date that violent video games cause serious risks for children?
Interestingly, the most compelling research is also some of the most complex, and that is a meta-analysis which basically is a statistical way of combining all of the studies that have been done and coming up with an average result. On average, what do the studies say? And when you do that, we published such a meta-analysis in 2010 in which there were over 130,000 participants in the various studies that were combined into this meta-analysis. And what we found was that regardless of research method, and I'll give you some examples of each in a moment, whether it was an experimental research method where participants are randomly assigned, say, to play a violent game or a non-violent game, and then later aggressive behaviors measured, or whether it's your standard kind of cross-sectional correlational study where you basically do a survey, or whether it's a longitudinal study where you measure the same research participants at least twice, in some studies 3 or 4 times over a long period of time. Regardless of what research method you use, you get the same results. That is, exposure to violent video games increases the likelihood of aggressive behavior. It increases aggressive ways of thinking. It increases what you might think of as angry affect, emotion, sometimes called state hostility or just anger. And those same games also tend to decrease helpful behavior, or what we tend to call prosocial behavior. And the fact that when you look at all of the studies at the same time using this statistical procedure, and that regardless of how you do the study, regardless of whether the study's done on Japanese children or children from Singapore or the United States or Germany or Portugal, regardless of where the research participants come from, and for the most part, pretty much regardless of age, regardless of whether they're male or female, you get the same results. And when that happens, when you get that kind of convergence, that is as definitive as what you're ever going to see in science.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question for Brad Bushman. Brad told me recently about a study he conducted using male and female avatars, and I had to ask, what is an avatar? An avatar is the character in the video game that you're controlling through the controls. And Brad, would you please explain to us what that study consisted of and what you found?
Violent video games can also reinforce stereotypes. For example, we've done studies showing that if people are randomly assigned to play a violent video game as a male avatar, they're more aggressive than if they're randomly assigned to play the game as a female avatar. This is true for both male and female players, but especially for male players who may be more likely to identify with the male avatars. And stereotypically, males are more violent than females. We also found that if you randomly assign players to play a violent video game as a black avatar versus a white avatar, they're more aggressive if they, after the game is turned off, they're more aggressive if they played the game as a black avatar than as a white avatar. And stereotypically, blacks are considered to be more violent than whites.
So, you know, I've been reading up on the effects of violent video games, and one of the things that I found most concerning were these neurological and physical changes to a child who plays a lot of video games. And there's one study in particular that you did that I thought was just mind-blowing. It's with the photos of the baby, the smiling baby, and the one with, can you explain how you conducted that study and what it showed us? Right.
This was a study, and actually now there's several more like it, done by a woman who at the time was a graduate student, now is a PhD person. Her name's Kira Bailey, and a cognitive neuroscience colleague of mine by the name of Robert West. They do research on brainwave patterns, and the way that they measure brainwave patterns is you may have seen photos of people with, they kind of look like skull caps, but they basically paste 64 electrodes on a person's
Yeah, I saw
head.
the photo. They had like a shower cap on, but they're actually monitoring how the brain
Right, there's wires coming
activity
out.
is moving. Right.
Right,
okay,
and
okay.
what you do is you record which parts of the brain are generating electrical activity,
Right.
and you can coordinate that with whatever kind of tasks you want them to do. So in one of the key studies that has actually been replicated now, we have gamers play a lot of violent video games, as many as 40 hours a week in this one sample. Then we have a non-gaming sample. Well, they aren't actually non-gaming because you can't find non-gamers anymore.
Do you call them high gamers and low gamers?
So we call them
right?
high gamers and low gamers.
Okay, I remember that part.
The low gamers play fewer than 3 hours a week is what
Okay.
they're reporting. And we show them a series of photos, and for each photo then they rate the photo. In this particular study we were having them rate the colorfulness of each photo. Now some of the photos are positive. They show very sort of happy images. So they might have a smiling baby, or a father holding a baby, or a family doing something
Universally
together.
positive
But
image,
they're,
right?
yeah, they're regarded as positive images, and it actually comes from there's a standard set of photos that have been rated on all these things that you can get these photos from. We also have negative but nonviolent images. So these would be images, sort of photos of people who have some kind of disease. So there might be some bad tumor or cancerous growth or something on a part of their face. Again, it's negative, it evokes negative emotional reactions, but it's not violent.
Right.
And then a third set of photos are considered negative violent images. So, for example, one image shows a man holding a woman around the neck and with a knife pointing at her neck.
Right.
So it's negative, but it's negative because of the violent content. And while they're doing these ratings, all these nice little wires are recording what part of the brain is active, what part of the brain is not so active.
So the subjects are looking at these photographs, and you're monitoring how their brain activity is changing based
Right.
on what they're looking at.
Right.
Okay.
And in fact, we're not really interested in how they rate the photos.
Right.
I mean, they don't know that.
Right.
But we're interested in what is the brain doing,
Right.
what part of the brain is active. And of course, as you might guess, negative photos tend to lead to somewhat different brain activation patterns than positive photos.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing in this particular study is that violent gamers tended to show brainwave patterns that were somewhat similar when they were rating positive images and violent negative images, unlike the non-gamers, or actually the low gamers. Right? The low gamers did not at all link the violent images in terms of what their brain was doing.
So it sounds like a cognitive association is being made between happy, nice thoughts or happy,
Right.
nice images and violence as a result of playing the games. Like
Yes.
somehow violence is now categorized within the brain as something that's good or positive or fun, because that's probably how they feel about playing video games. Right.
That's one. Yeah. The one obvious interpretation is that their long history of having fun playing violent video games now leads some part of their brain to associate violence against other people with positive emotional reactions.
There's also some fMRI studies showing that certain parts of the brain are like depressed or less active in high gamers. And tell us about that.
Yes, there's some new studies as well as some recent studies kind of showing the same thing. We have some research coming out fairly shortly showing that, again, we sort of actually, let me back up. In this particular study, everyone who's in this study is a gamer. But what we have is a group of college students who play primarily violent games, and then another group of gamers who play primarily nonviolent games. So they're all quite experienced at playing games. And then what we do is we had them play a violent or a nonviolent game, and in fact each participant played both. In fact, they would play them for short periods of time and then switch to the other game and play for a short period of time, all the while in an fMRI, in the big magnet.
Right.
And then we look at, again, what parts of the brain are active and are there differences between violent gamers and non-violent gamers in terms of how their brain is responding to these two different tasks, playing a violent game or playing a non-violent game. I should point out that the game being played is the same. It's just one has violent content in it and the other's set up to be non-violent, but it's actually the same game. So they're actually doing the same motions.
So they're different versions of the same
They're
game,
different
one with
versions.
violent content, one with non-violent
Exactly.
content. Okay.
And one of the things that was most interesting to us is that the violent gamers, when they were playing the violent part of this game, there was active suppression of parts of the brain that are known to be involved in emotion and emotion processing. Whereas for the non-violent gamers, when they were playing the violent parts of the game, that same part of the brain lit up. It became more active rather than less.
Well, I think a normal person would react emotionally to killing other people, even if it's a game. I think at least in the beginning, it's going to be a little upsetting. I know that when I saw the kids playing those games, I was completely disgusted. Why, it's just after a while you walk by and you see it again, and even I became a little bit desensitized to it because they played it, and I walked back and forth enough times and saw the same stuff going on the video screen. Yeah. But it sounds almost like playing enough video games could sort of, get towards sociopathy, about basically shutting down emotionally in relation to violence, because I'm assuming desensitization over time, it's sort of your body, you have to avoid cognitive dissonance, you have to sort of stop feeling emotion if you're going to do something that's otherwise, repulsive
sort of violates
to yourself.
Your standards.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Wow.
And while this particular study, because we didn't experimentally manipulate who played a lot of violent games or not violent games, it's a little bit riskier to draw the causal conclusions, but there are lots of other studies out there, some experimental studies as well as some long-term longitudinal studies that allow pretty strong causal conclusions along those lines. That is, playing violent video games over time reduces the normal negative emotional reaction that most people have when faced with scenes of real violence. They don't have the same heart rate increase that you would normally expect. There's just a whole bunch of different measures, including some interesting studies, experimental studies using fMRI kind of data, again, showing the same kind of desensitization.
And there's also some relationship between attention deficit disorder and playing a lot of video games. And here's my question. Is it that people who have attention deficit disorder somehow are drawn to the games because somehow it allows them to focus on something? Or is it that the gaming actually disturbs their mental processes to the point where they become problematic, or that they develop attention deficit disorder? Or do we know?
We don't know for sure about some aspects of this, but the data that are emerging pretty clearly suggests that certain kinds of attention related to ability to ignore irrelevant things, so which is basically what attention deficit disorder is, right? These are
inability to ignore irrelevant. Okay, right, that makes sense.
So kids in a classroom, right, if they're going to be paying attention to a teacher, they can't be distracted by a car driving by or any little thing that just happens.
A fly in the room, or something going on. Right, okay.
Right. In my family, we think of this as the, oh, look, a kitty effect.
Okay. Okay. That's exactly what I do when I see a kitty.
That's exactly
I totally
right.
get that.
That's exactly right. And so there are now some experimental studies out of at least 2 different laboratories in the U.S. showing that taking non-gamers and training them on a standard violent video game for as few as 10 hours, this is like 10 one-hour sessions, produces a decrease in what's called proactive executive control, a form of attention. There are also some longitudinal studies showing that self-reported and parent-reported kinds of attention problems, including diagnoses of attention deficit problems, that over time, kids who play a lot of video games, and the effect seems to be stronger if they're playing a lot of violent video games, that their attention problems get worse over time, even if after you control for a whole host of things at the beginning of the study.
So whether they start out as ADD kids or not, they either developed ADD or the ADD was exacerbated by video game play.
Right.
Oof, not a good thing.
No.
You know, I was researching and found recently online this internet gaming disorder, and I just want to read a little bit of this. This was just, it kind of blew my mind. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-5, which is, of course, the manual used by clinicians and researchers to diagnose and classify mental disorders, has added this internet gaming disorder in Section 3, which means it's a section that's being looked at and ended up. And let me just read a little bit of what was said here. The gamers play compulsively to the exclusion of other interests, and their persistent and recurrent online activity results in clinically significant impairment or distress. The study suggests that when these individuals are engrossed in internet games, certain pathways in their brains are triggered in the same direct and intense way that a drug addict's brain is affected by a particular substance. The gaming prompts a neurological response that influences feelings of pleasure and reward, and the result, in the extreme, is manifested as addictive behavior. Now, I read some of these studies, and what I read was that when a drug addict doesn't have his drug, the changes in his brain chemistry are like, it causes the addict to need the drug, to become obsessed with finding the drug, obsessed with getting another fix, so to speak. And the study I read said that the exact same physiological changes can occur in children if they do become addicted to gaming, because it's not like, oh, they just like to play the games a lot. It's actually a physiological change and a real addiction. Is that a fair statement?
Well, that's what that's what seems to be coming out of the more medical studies, and I can't really evaluate the medical parts because it gets a little bit beyond what I do. But I do know that looking at the behavior itself, my colleague, Dr. Doug Gentile, who is probably the world's leading authority on video game addiction right now. A lot of his studies are what's leading the American Psychiatric Association to look into this problem.
Right.
But there are other research teams around the world looking at this also. The internet, what they're calling internet addiction or internet gaming addiction, actually looks a lot like gambling addiction. And gambling addiction is a defined disorder, has been for a number of years now. If you take the symptoms, basically the criteria for diagnosing a person as having a gambling addiction, and you change the words, so instead of referring to gambling, it has to do with gaming, and then apply that, those criteria to children, adolescents, and as well as young adults. All have been sampled in the U.S. and in several other countries as well. What you find is that roughly 8% of gamers show at least a moderate level of what would be called gambling addiction, and of course, in the fairly near future will probably be called gaming addiction or internet gaming addiction.
Right.
And the key to this definition isn't how many hours a week a person is playing, although it's somewhat related to how many hours a week. But the key is whether or not the behavior, in this case gaming, interferes with other aspects of one's life. So, is it interfering with relationships with parents? Is it interfering with performance on the job, or for kids, performance in school? Are they lying about it to people in order to keep going?
Like an addict would.
Like an addict would. And so again, that's really the key. Is it interfering? Again, it isn't strictly the number of hours.
Well, I can tell you, I mean, I've talked to parents. I was in Aspen a couple years ago, and I struck up a conversation with a lady there, and we started talking about violent video games because I was doing the research, and you and I co-wrote something at that time. And her face just fell, and she started telling me a story about her son. And her son was this, active skier, I mean, outdoor kind of kid. They live in Aspen, for goodness sakes, of course you're going to be outdoors. Well, one Christmas, they bought him one video game, and they said it was the absolute worst mistake of their lives. The child became addicted almost immediately. Wow. His entire personality changed. She said he was always just a mild-mannered kid, agreeable with his parents, and he became extremely obstinate. She said she couldn't get him off the games. And he developed a vitamin D deficiency from being in Aspen. I mean, so I think if you talk to parents about how difficult it is to rip their kids away from the games, I think this addiction idea really resonates with the parents, because I think we've all fought with our kids, especially teenage boys, about how much time they're spending on the video games. And I mean, I guess they're fun. To me, it doesn't look like fun, but I guess they really like them, and it's very difficult to get them to even come to dinner. I mean, they're hungry, and yet they still can't. Like an addict would not go to dinner because he's too busy trying to find his drugs or whatever.
Well, a well-designed game is fun. I know. I've played
you've been
them.
playing since
I've been playing since 1977.
Right.
Back when they were on.
So you're not
mainframe
biased
computers.
against games per se.
No,
you like games.
I like games, and in fact, my kids grew up playing video games, but they didn't play violent ones, and there was a lot of rules, restrictions. In fact, at one point, I removed them all from the house because they were becoming a problem. And kept them out of the house for a couple of years, and when the kids got a little bit older and could handle them a little bit better, reintroduced them. And yeah, I mean, the games teach a lot of things. I mean, they're designed to be excellent teachers in multiple ways.
And I remember you telling me early on that when you were first studying this, someone had told you that originally the violent video games were created for the military, because the young men in the military would, get into a combat situation and literally shoot at the trees or shoot in the air. They didn't want to kill the opposing soldiers, and they created these games to get these kids, these young men in the military, ready to shoot to kill. Not to go out and to be skittish or to hesitate, to be ready, willing, and able to kill. And then I think you also told me that the games that came on the market didn't have any of the controls. It's like the military games at least had controls. They had to follow procedure, or else they would lose or whatever. And then when they hit the market for the public, all the military controls were taken out, and yet all the violence remained. So it's like the worst possible set of circumstances.
This is. I mean, historically, one of the problems armies have had, military has had, is getting civilian soldiers, which is what the U.S. military has historically been, is getting civilian soldiers to actually fire at the enemy, to actually shoot to kill a person. This was true in the Revolutionary War, this was true in the Civil War, this is, and the military has taken steps over time to try to come up with better training methods to reduce this problem. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if you believe that your country should have a strong military and they should be effective, right? You want them to be, able to carry out their mission. What's weird is when the same techniques that have proven useful for the military to be turned over to every 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old, and without any of the sort of command and control aspects that are typical of military training. The same thing's just like SWAT training. You want your SWAT people to be able to
do what they
have to do, but there are rules of engagement, and it's all
protocol and very serious chains of command.
Right, and you want that, but you don't want every 12-year-old in the country to have the ability to pull the trigger on someone, or the ability to seriously harm someone, the ability, not just the physical ability to shoot and hit a target, but the emotional ability to try to actually kill someone.
Well, let me ask you.
It's what Dave Grossman calls the will to kill.
The will to kill, right. Well, let me ask you just a very basic question. If you could get the ears of all the parents in the United States for just 30 seconds, what would you say to them to try to convince them to take this issue seriously?
For 30 seconds, okay. Video games are excellent teachers. They teach whatever the content is of the game, whether it's harmful to your child or helpful. You need to know what they're doing, and you need to control what kind of games they play and for how long they play them.
Meaning they probably have to sit down and watch the game with the child to see what's going on.
Exactly.
Okay, same question for Brad Bushman. If you had just a 30-second time to talk to the parents of American kids who are playing video games, what would you say to them?
My message would be, don't let your kids play age-inappropriate games. So video games are rated. For example, if the rating is M, that's for mature players 17 and older. So if your child is under 17, he or she should not play that game. If the video game is rated T, that's for teens 13 and older. So if your child is under 13, he or she should not play that game. Also, researchers have suggested that that parents have screens in public places. For example, I'm a parent. We have 3 children, and our screens, our computer is in the kitchen, and we have software on it to block out content that's violent. Also on our televisions, we have blocked out programs that are violent. You have to type in a password to access those programs. We don't let our children have television sets in their bedrooms. Our kids all have iPads and iPhones, so we told them, if you're going to use those in your room, you have to keep the room door open, and when you go to bed at night, you have to give us your iPad or iPhone so you don't stay up all night playing video games. So those are some things that parents can do. Parents can also use guidelines from pediatricians to help decide what their children should see or do. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that children between 2 and 17 years old have no more than 2 hours of screen time per day for entertainment. That's TV, movies, video games. For children under 2, they recommend no screen time. So this is a big problem because I think the average American child spends over 7.5 hours per day consuming media, which is well above the 2-hour recommendation from the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Well, thank you so much, Craig, for coming, and I know we're going to do
My
another
pleasure.
show together. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed talking to you about this very important topic.
Thank you very much for tuning in to Meet the Professors. I'm your host, Deana Pollard Sacks. Thank you for watching.